Hey, good day, everybody, and welcome to your live event. My name is Eric Wynkoop, and I'm the Director of Culinary Instruction here at Rouxbe, and also one of the instructors in your courses. Today's event is my office hours, and I want to welcome each one of you to this opportunity to answer your questions. And I look forward to this. It's really a round robin of sorts, and a lot of fun for me to think on my feet or think on my seat as it goes today. And, as we get started, I want to mention just a couple of items, housekeeping items. It's always nice to the best of our ability online here, to facilitate a conversation of sorts, a discussion. And to that end, I always ask for your cooperation in submitting questions and comments too. And, I'll take the time to answer those to the best of my ability. If I come across something that requires a little digging here or a little research there, I might ask you to send that question in to support@rouxbe.com, and then I can get back to you individually very shortly. Okay. And then the other part of today's program is that if you want to enter a question on your screen, in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a dialog box. And you can enter your question in that dialog box, and it'll make its way to me. And then you'll see it appear on the right-hand side of your screen, where you should see a bunch of questions loaded up already. Now, one additional point, if you look at each individual question that's already loaded, you'll see on the right side a heart-shaped icon. And if you would like me to address that question a little bit sooner than later, you can click on that icon and it'll push it up to a higher priority level. And don't worry, I'll get to all the questions today, regardless of the priority level. Okay, so as we get started, let me just begin from the top of the list here. Okay, and here goes from Brenda. What is the best way that I can incorporate the use of fresh herbs in my cooking? I love this question because I love fresh herbs. And I think everybody should love fresh herbs. And, my response is going to be very brief, and that is just start adding fresh herbs to your dishes. And then you're going to learn what you like and how much you like, when you like it, what sort of other flavors are compatible with the particular herb that you're playing with, that you have in your refrigerator or in your garden. There are a couple of kind of broad categories of herbs that, categorizations that I think about. On one hand, we have herbs that are hardy herbs, those that have very robust aromas, and they tend to hold on to their flavor even through some degree of cooking. And, example would be rosemary. Another common example would be thyme. Let's say marjoram or oregano could fall into those categories. They tend to be very bold in flavor. And it's these herbs that, I tend to add to the dish while it's cooking. And, you make the choice whether you want to add it early or at the midpoint. Those flavors tend to linger, and they will mix and marry with the other ingredients and flavors that are present, and they'll mellow out a little bit during the cooking process to produce something that is very enjoyable. Now, there's another category of herbs. Examples include basil and cilantro, and some of the other more delicate herbs. Larger leafy herbs is another way to characterize those very often. And those tend to have more delicate flavors, in my opinion. And I like to add those right at service time, just at the very end of cooking, so that those more delicate leaves, while they might discolor a bit, perhaps they don't become too ugly looking. And certainly if you add them right at service time, like when you bring the food out on the table, or even bring a bowl of the freshly cut leaves to the table, so that you and your fellow diners can add those herbs real time to your dishes and enjoy the more delicate aromas that will be drawn out of those herbs, often from the heat, right, of the dishes that we're eating. But even if it's a room temperature or a cool dish, these will also benefit from the fresh herbs. I will often mix together basil, for example, Thai basil and mint and cilantro. And I like to, leave those in pieces that are fairly large, sometimes even whole leaf, so that I'm enjoying those aromas and those flavors, tossed in with a salad. And sometimes, when your fellow diners aren't expecting it, they happen upon just a robust hit of flavor and aroma. And it can be a few seconds of wonderful refreshment, as you're eating your way through a salad or a pasta dish or whatever it is that you have at the table. But again, my suggestion is very simply to jump on in with some fresh herbs. You might start out with just a couple and learn what it is that you like and what flavors that those go well with, in your opinion. You can always consult some sort of a guide, such as the Flavor Bible. There's also such thing as a vegetarian flavor Bible. They're pretty similar in content, but these will give you some suggestions on how to pair certain flavors with regional flavor profiles or certain dishes or particular ingredients. And this can help inform your decision as well. But, really, even, before you get maybe bogged down, I'll say, with a book, just discover and, enjoy the process. And you might take your own notes. I continue to take notes myself. As I'm cooking and baking and bringing flavors together, so that I can revisit those combinations at a later time. But jump on in and enjoy. All right. Thanks, Brenda. All right. Next question. How do I keep cilantro and parsley fresh? Is there a way to keep them fresh for a few days after buying them? Also, any advice about purchasing dried beans, black beans, etc.? How do you tell if they are fully ripe? Okay, so a couple of different food categories here. We'll address the fresh herbs, cilantro and parsley. And so a way to keep them fresh, once you bring them home or once you harvest them from your garden. I guess if you have a garden, you can just harvest them real time, just prior to using them, which is really ideal. But if you're shopping at the grocery store, like many of us do, then the question becomes, how do you extend that shelf life a little bit longer? And at least a couple of approaches come to mind that I use from time to time. I might switch back and forth for whatever reason, but one is to stand up the bunches in a container with a little bit of water, like a bouquet of flowers. And that does very well. I used to use that technique regularly in restaurant kitchens and found success with that. I'll use it once in a while in my own refrigerator here at home if I have the space to stand it up. That's probably the biggest variable. And then you want to swap out that water. I recommend every day. And you might even consider trimming the ends of the stems off as needed to keep that area fresh. Otherwise the water can discolor and get a little bit stinky if it's not changed, and that's going to hasten the decline of those herbs, shorten that shelf life. Another approach is to wrap the herbs in a damp towel. It could be a paper towel, it could be a cloth towel, not too wet. Cilantro especially is susceptible to rot if it sweats or otherwise gets too much moisture in with the bunch. So another thought comes to mind, and that is it depends on how densely packed the bunch is. There are some times when you get just a loose bunch from the grocery store, and other times when it's very, very densely packed. And in which case you may want to split it up into 2 or 3 or 4 smaller bunches, or even just take the rubber band or the twisty tie off completely and split those up, wrapping each smaller bunch in a damp towel. Now the purpose of the towel is to keep some of the circulating air off of the herbs. A refrigerator fundamentally tries to dehydrate your food. That's just what a refrigerator does. So it's helpful to protect some of these foods from the circulation of the air. And then also the dampness of the towel is going to add back in some of that moisture that's being lost to the refrigerator environment itself. Okay, and so give that a try. And then the corollary to my recommendations here is to use the product and try to use it up, of course, before it has a chance to go bad. There's nothing like picking little rotten parsley leaves or cilantro leaves out of the bunch. So buy in quantities that you can use timely, and then use that product liberally in your food and enjoy those fresh herbs. Thank you. All right, next question. What is the best way to roast vegetables without using oil? Okay, I will start off by saying that in our courses we do have tasks or lessons that will introduce you to oil-free or no oil roasting, but very fundamentally, a common guideline is, and this isn't, there are exceptions, I should say, but one approach is if you're cutting the item, for example, let's say large dice of a sweet potato, you might consider tossing these very lightly in stock, right, or some sort of a liquid. It could be water if that's all you have, and then you put that on your sheet pan. I recommend a silicone baking mat because they hold a lot of heat while they're in the oven, and they produce nice browning on the food. And so you put that product in your oven, and the moisture on the exterior is going to slow down, on one hand, the dehydration and the caramelization process, giving the heat some time to penetrate that piece of food and to cook it. Now, by the time that liquid evaporates, then you can see the caramelization process starting. That browning is going to begin on the exterior of those cut pieces. Now, if you find that the pieces are still underdone and your browning isn't quite where you want it, you can always baste the product with that same liquid to repeat that process, to kind of slow down the browning while the cooking is encouraged, the internal cooking. Again, as it evaporates, the surface dries, then the caramelization will resume. Okay. Now, you can always omit the tossing in the liquid step and put larger cut pieces, especially directly onto the silicone baking sheet. And you can turn those pieces from time to time to even out the caramelization on all sides. Okay. Now, if you are roasting larger whole products, like a whole sweet potato, like I'm doing a couple of times each week, then just set those on your baking sheet again, I recommend some sort of a liner, and then bake those till they're done. One recommendation that I will share is with a sweet potato anyway, is to bake it until it becomes really soft, and you see those sugars start to ooze out from the skin. Then you know that the sugars have made a shift inside, and you have this just beautiful candy-like sweet potato in the end. Just as an example, okay? But give that a try, Christina, and see what sort of success that you have developing some nice flavor through caramelization on the surface in the end. All right, thank you. All right, next question from Anne. What cereals can I have that are plant-based? Also, what's better, pasta sauce with lower sugar or pasta sauce with reduced sodium? And also, am I allowed coconut oil on this plant-based diet? If not, what can I use in place of it? Okay, so we'll take these in order. Cereals, by definition, are going to be coming from the earth, and they are going to be plant-based foods. And so feel free to eat any cereals that you want, right? Certainly if you have some individual, dietary restrictions or, health concerns that you're addressing, then you might choose to avoid, something, such as gluten-containing grains, if that's the case. But otherwise, there are many cereals to choose from. When you say cereal, I'm thinking about a cereal grain, by the way, right? So corn and barley and oats and quinoa. And so this is when I'm saying just choose whatever you want. And I guess it's going to be true of processed forms of these cereal grains. So whether it's in a flake form or if it's a rolled oat, these are still going to be plant-based. So you're free to consume whatever it is that you want. I always remind people to try to eat a variety of foods, right, on the plant-based diet. That's really, I think, the beauty of delving into the plant world, is that there's just an incredible array of choices. And then, with that comes the visual aesthetic of these different colors and different shapes. There's the palate aesthetic of the different textures and different tastes and flavors that come along with this. And then you have that additional benefit that I don't even worry about, and that is nutrition and all those awesome phytochemicals that come along with these different plant-based foods. And so the goal really is to eat a variety of these foods, and then you don't have to worry about nutrition, because that just automatically comes with the package. Number two, so what's better, pasta sauce with lower sugar or reduced sodium? I would say a little bit of both, but again, it just depends on your own preference. But overall, when it comes to added sugar and added sodium, the general good advice, I think the best practice is to really to moderate that, because neither one of those are going to do us any good in the long term, right, in terms of our health. So certainly if you're making your own pasta sauce, you have full control. Now, I will also add that very often when we start to cut back on added sugars and added salts, we notice that, because those are a couple of very appealing tastes in any foods for our palate. And all of a sudden, when we start to cut back on those things, the food itself feels less than satisfying. So, consider backing off on salts and sugars very slowly. You might cut back by 50% rather than 100%. Allow your palate to adjust. Cut back by 50% again, and then see if there's a sweet spot in there, no pun intended, I guess, that you can live with, right, in terms of the balance of those tastes in order to produce a food that's still satisfying to you. I think in the end, part of the joy of cooking is the joy of eating. And we shouldn't torture ourselves or necessarily live some strict austerity plan, when it comes to the tastes and flavors in our food. Again, unless you have a particular health issue that you're addressing that requires, right, the omission of salts and sugars. All right. Another consideration when it comes to sweeteners is to use whole food sweeteners, which are less problematic than these refined sugars that are so common. So, whole food sources of sweetness, include my favorite, which is the date, which can be made into a date paste or a date liquid. Just, you get to adjust the moisture level. But other foods can be used as well. All right, it might be a puree of apples or something else, and so you get to kind of play with ingredients. And so many things can go well in a pasta sauce. Other fruits. So it could be fresh cherries, it could be fresh plums. So have some fun with that, and discover some whole food sources of sweetness along the way. And then part 3 of Anne's series here. Am I allowed coconut oil in the plant-based diet? Yeah, absolutely. Again, any of the fats that you choose are totally up to you. How much you choose is going to be up to you as well. Once again, when it comes to added fats, I think the best advice, the best practice is to moderate that, is to minimize that. And again, depending on whether you might have a specific health concern that you're addressing or not, you might even consider omitting added fats. Coconut oil is fine in moderation. I think on one hand, coconut oil has been popularized in the popular press over the last, say, decade or so. But in more recent years, there has been increasing research from the medical community that has highlighted the saturated fat that's present in coconut fat. And the medical community has tagged coconut fat as one that should only really be eaten in smaller amounts because of the saturated fat content. But I'll leave that up to you to figure out in terms of how much of that you want to include in your diet. All right, thank you. Next up, we have a question that says, I'm taking the Forks Over Knives class and cook without oil. Okay, I've read that nonstick pans are unhealthy. Is there one that you could recommend that is not unhealthy? My quick answer is no. And this is, one reason why the recommendation really across the board is to cook at a relatively lower heat with nonstick pans. And I'll say that I'm not intimately familiar with, these technologies, but generally speaking, there is some instability that's brought to that surface at high temperatures. And so we have, it could be off-gassing or something else that can contaminate food or even the atmosphere in your kitchen. And so, I would say stick with moderate or temperatures with nonstick pans, and avoid that high heat cooking. Now, there's always the opportunity to practice your no oil cooking with other cookware like stainless steel cookware, and we have a lesson in our courses that's referred to as the mercury ball test or the water ball test, and it's very simply one where you add a little bit of water, maybe an eighth of a teaspoon or a quarter of a teaspoon, and watch what it does in the pan as the pan heats up. And you're going to bring the pan up to a point where the water ball sort of slides around freely on the surface of the pan, and that's going to indicate that the pan is pretty darn hot. And you can add food products, and start to develop some browning, right, which translates to flavor. And there's also going to be some decreased sticking within that temperature range that you've reached. And then you can deglaze the pan as the color develops, and that also will cool down the pan so you can avoid burning the product. And then you can move on through your cooking process, either adding additional ingredients or removing that item from the pan, whatever is called for at that time. So do consider, Jerry, this no oil technique in stainless steel pans as well. And you can certainly use this in cast iron. The characteristics of the water ball will be a little bit different because the surface is typically a little bit more porous than a stainless steel pan, but it's all about your practice. And what I tell our students is that while you're visually looking for this ball of water to slide around on the surface, you also want to be feeling with your hands and noticing the heat on your face or your arms, just how hot the pan itself is getting. And that's your learning process, okay? So that you're going to get to a point where you don't need to do the mercury ball test or this water ball test every single time. You can just put your hand over the pan, knowing which heat setting it's on, and how many minutes or approximately the pan has been on the fire, and you're going to know when it's time to cook. Okay, so that's where eventually you want to land, okay, with this process. Okay, so do give that a try. Thank you. All right, next we have a series of questions from Robin. Buying everything organic is not always doable. I agree. I do use the Dirty Dozen list as a guide. Excellent. I was wondering if the food that is not organic and or cooked, does that help mediate the pesticides in anyway? Do you know the answer? So I'll start responding to this. I think there's potentially a much broader and deeper discussion or set of data or information out there that you may or may not want to dig into. But when it comes to preparing foods, any foods really. I mean, if you look at certified organic foods, there are chemicals that are allowed to be used on these things, but maybe a little bit less harmful than the conventional group of chemicals. But anyway, if we have any concern of chemicals, of course we're going to wash the food. Usually running water and some rubbing is sufficient to remove the majority of that. You can always use just a very, very light soapy solution and rinse immediately. A next step is perhaps to soak foods, certain foods, and then to discard the water. A next step to consider, again, depending on the food item, is to peel the food, since much of any chemical residue is going to reside on the surface of that food. I'm not saying that none of it, penetrates the food, but a lot of it does reside on the surface, so it can be peeled. And then beyond that, go ahead and enjoy the food. I think there's plenty of discussion out there that talks about this sort of concern in relation to the health values of a plant-based diet or more plants in the diet anyway. And all of the discussion that I've read says that the health benefits that you get from eating more plants, even with the skin on, will outweigh concerns around possible problems that might arise from any chemicals that might be on the surface of the food. And so do think about that as well. And certainly don't avoid eating your fruits and vegetables and other plant-based foods due to any of these concerns. So I think, yeah, that generally addresses the question set here. And yeah, have fun cooking and enjoy the food. I think first and foremost, with no anxiety, right? No stress. Just go out and enjoy. Thank you. And next up, let's say I'm having a problem keeping basil fresh for more than a day or two after purchasing. Not sure how to store it. I've tried using a plant and a container of store-bought with no luck. Okay, with basil, generally I'll say that basil is a little bit delicate, and in the refrigerator, for example, basil doesn't like really cold temperatures. Just overnight, it will. The leaves will become dark and very, very damaged looking. So a slightly warmer environment is going to be preferable. And certainly you want to protect basil, if it does go in the fridge, from the cold circulating air by wrapping it in a towel. And on the other hand, basil can also be damaged in bright, hot sunlight. And so you want to find a middle ground. If you're using a potted plant, basil likes sun, but just not super intense, super hot. And then give that a try, right, in terms of the protection of the refrigerator. And then the next part of this is to use it. If it's in a pot, from the store, it might be a good idea to repot it into something larger so that the roots can stretch out and the plant itself will be a little bit happier. And then it's probably more apt to continue producing some delicious leaves for you over some time. Okay. But definitely think about the temperature extremes as you're storing basil in the refrigerator, for example. Okay. Thank you. Best way to peel ginger, what tools to use, how to preserve it. Okay. Usually I use a soup spoon, and any kind of spoon works, but a soup spoon has a sort of a larger sort of a flat-ish surface that I can use to scrape the relatively thin skin off of ginger, and I find that to be very effective. I have certainly used a vegetable peeler in the past, and while they are effective, they remove a lot of the ginger, the usable ginger as well. Now, I just said the word usable ginger. Let me also explain that the skin is edible, okay? And I often don't peel ginger, and I'll just grate it or I'll finely cut it up, and the skin goes into the food as well. There's absolutely nothing wrong with eating the skin. It doesn't lend any flavor. I taste everything. I'm curious what things taste like. And I can tell you that ginger skin doesn't lend a lot of flavor. But it also doesn't harm the food, and it does add fiber, right? So that there's a plus there. But if you don't want to peel it for some reason, just keep the skin on. How to preserve it. So ginger will dry out, and I don't know what affects the rotting of ginger, but it will, certain things will cause it to break down, either at room temperature or even in the cooler. And so, I find that if you want to, actually preserve it, then you want to think about putting it into an acid or a salt or even sugar or honey in the traditional preservation manner. But otherwise, protect it from dry environments, which will dehydrate it. It's still usable, however. And then also, wrapping it or otherwise protecting it from that air circulation in the refrigerator is helpful. Okay. But otherwise, do enjoy ginger. It is a magical ingredient, right? Good for digestion, stimulates appetite, and just tastes really good and has other health benefits as well. And so do add ginger to your beverages and cookies and anything else that you're preparing. Thank you. All right, next up, I have a series of questions here from Carol. I don't really like raw kale and usually just use it in soups because I know it's good for us. Can you inspire me to use it differently? Please explain when to choose a certain variety over another. Is it dependent upon the meal or just preference? Let me answer this last part first. And, I will address kale as well as other ingredients, okay, that have different types or varieties within that given group. The variety or type that you choose is based upon a couple of things. One would be tradition around that regional cuisine, right, or that recipe, if that applies. And then the second part is going to be your personal preference. And so in other words, you can do whatever you want, right, at the end of the day. And I think I play with both of these paths. If I'm trying to produce something that is distinctly Indian or more authentically Japanese, then I'll try to use varieties of foods, eggplant, for example, that are traditionally associated with those cuisines. Now, on the other hand, if I'm just cooking more generally, I'm going to use whatever I have, whatever is in the garden or at the grocery store or just in the refrigerator. And I'm not going to worry about the variety. Okay, so personal preference, I guess, or convenience is going to be the rule of the day at that point. Now, in terms of inspiring you to use kale, you can chiffonade kale, and which means you're cutting it into thin ribbon-like strips. You can include that into a stir fry or a saute. You can include that in a savory pancake. You can include that into quick bread. You can include that into a blended drink or into a cold salad. You might even fold that into a casserole, a hot pasta dish, mac and cheese, for example, with an internal garnish of some chopped or chiffonade of kale. And all of that it'll soften, it'll cook down a bit. If it's blended, of course, it's going to sort of disappear texturally. And then the flavors will combine or sometimes be overshadowed by the other ingredients, which might be nice for you. And these are some ways to incorporate kale into most anything that you make. Okay, so do give that a try. And this is, one reason why we introduce knife skills very early on in our courses. It's good to think about how the chosen knife cut, whether it's in a dice form or something skinny and long, whether it's in a chiffonade or minced, all these choices that we have will lend a different eating experience in the finished preparation. And so your knife cut should be part of your overall cooking strategy as well. Okay? And so give that a try. Thank you. And next up, I've got a question from Carol. I would like to cook baby bok choy. I enjoyed at Chinese restaurants, but realized that they probably use more salt than I should eat, as well as MSG in their cooking. How can I steam and finish them to bring out their natural flavor in a whole food plant-based recipe? Okay, so if we are indeed using the smallest size bok choy, which in diameter is pretty small and they can be fairly short, if you steam those whole, they're going to be sufficiently tender after really just a short period of time. It might be 2 or 3 or so minutes at a pretty strong steam. You want to do some testing for doneness along the way, as we do with any cooking method, to choose your desired level or degree of doneness. You want to have a sauce ready for that. And lately I've been kind of stuck on tahini-based sauces. And with the tahini, you can thin that down with a little bit of water. You can add some lemon juice if you want a little bit of souriness to it. You can add some spices to it. And you can drizzle some of that over very lightly, right? Drizzle some of that over the finished bok choy. And those rich flavors in that fat can be very satisfying against the grassiness and the lightness of the bok choy. Now, if you're using a slightly more mature bok choy, maybe a little bit larger in size and a little bit longer in length, then I recommend slicing those in half so that the heat will penetrate a little bit quicker, a little bit more evenly, and then you can follow through with the same approach. You might try one of our balsamic vinegar-based no oil dressings that has some body lent to it from a dried fruit puree, right, or one of our fruit pastes, which acts as a whole food sweetener as well. And that's a nice way to finish off some of these greens that you are going to be steaming. Yeah, give that a try. Another thing that we do at home is to very simply drizzle very lightly some toasted sesame oil over baby bok choy. Salt is optional. If you want to add a little bit of salt, that's fine. If you have some other salty things at the table, perhaps no more added salt to the bok choy is going to be satisfactory to your palate. But give that a try and see how that goes. I think part of the enjoyment is to maintain some of that crunchiness. So the delicate application of heat is going to be important here, giving you the enjoyment of chewing, that interactivity with the food. As we chew our food, different flavors can be experienced. Young bok choy has sweetness to it. It has some grassiness to it. You might get a little bit of bitterness from different parts of the leaves. And so we can enjoy these different aspects through the chewing process as well. All right, thank you. All right, next up, we have a question about plant-based sausages, vegan sausages. So have you had luck making them without using vital wheat gluten? Heard it's pretty unhealthy. And I think this second question refers to the vital wheat gluten rather than vegan sausages. Do you agree? And thanks for all your live events. Rose, I want to thank you for being here. You are what makes this happen. And so glad that you could join us today. And so when it comes to these plant-based sausages without using the vital wheat gluten, right, this isolated gluten from wheat flour, we make a lot of patty-formed, call them sausages here at home. These are legume-based. Sometimes they have other grains in them. And whole grains, right? And sometimes you might use a little bit of panko or some other breadcrumb as part of that binding of that mixture. Other vegetables that are cut pretty small and then sautéed in order to dry them out a bit. I don't recommend adding oil because that's going to inhibit binding. But these sort of things can add some nice meaty texture, some great flavor, and of course add some variety in terms of the nutrient profile as well. And fully cooked potatoes, act as a great binder. These would be russet potatoes. They act as a nice binder as well. On a rare occasion, we will form these into, a thin, long, Frankfurter sort of a shape. Just very rarely in my past, in my commercial cooking, restaurant cooking career, have I done that as well. But basically the same approach holds true. You want to look for binders. It could be whole grains, legumes, fully cooked potatoes. Will do the trick, so you can avoid vital wheat gluten. Now, vital wheat gluten, because it's mostly gluten, does give the finished product a relatively dense and somewhat meat-like consistency, whereas the products that I'm describing are going to have a much softer consistency, and they're going to be much less meat-like, although they might resemble sausage in some way. And you can certainly, add caramelization to them to make them look more like the original inspiration, that meat-based sausage. But they are going to be a little bit different. But you can certainly be, successful, I guess, with your finished product, whether it's going to be served on a hot dog bun or a hamburger bun or something like that. Okay. Now, in terms of your second part of the question, is vital wheat gluten unhealthy? Now, I'll say that it is a processed food. It is, isolating the gluten from the whole food. And, therefore, it is much less desirable, I would say, than the whole food products. So, my approach personally is to eat it in moderation. And in our home, in just very, very occasionally, very small amounts, really. And, another part of this discussion, which is, one that comes up once in a while in my life around these, I'll say, meat facsimiles, right? This idea of trying to replicate the texture or the look of meat when we're trying to get away from meat in our plant-based diet. And, that becomes a bit of a philosophical question. It becomes, of course, a very personal sort of a question, and one you might think about. I am just as apt to avoid eating vital wheat gluten because if I'm moving away from meat, I don't need meat at all, and I don't need my food to look like meat or feel like meat on the palate. And so do think about that as well. But yeah, certainly I wouldn't eat too much of it because it's a processed food, and we should be eating a lot of variety in our diet anyway for the best benefit. All right. Hope that's helpful and gives you some food for thought. Next up, what's the most important detail when making fermented vegan cheeses? All right. And thank you for this invitation. Absolutely. I'm glad that you're here, Ursula. Regarding any of this cheese making, regardless of what style of cheese it is, I would say that using clean and even sanitized equipment is going to be very important. I think especially perhaps if you're going to be introducing probiotics to your fermented plant-based cheese. Because you don't want to have competing microorganisms in the mixture along with the probiotics. Okay, so it's going to be sanitation is probably number one, and then beyond that, I think keep an open mind and be prepared to experiment with the passage of time. Many of these fermented plant-based cheeses that call for a probiotic. They take some time, maybe it's a day or two or three, to develop some of that characteristic tanginess that we might associate with cheese, some of that deeper flavor that comes with the multiplication, right, of these microorganisms. And then, as you start to add different ingredients to change flavor profiles, there's another level of experimentation that's going to be necessary. So keep an open mind and take lots of notes in the kitchen, and you're going to come up with variations that are uniquely yours and very enjoyable. All right, thank you. And you can see on your screen just below that Patrick has uploaded a link to one of our archived live events on plant-based cheeses. And while the discussion in this archived live event doesn't go specifically into fermented cheeses, there's a nice general introduction to plant-based cheeses that you might enjoy. Okay, and I'll take a moment here to say to everybody that we have a tremendous list of archived live events that are thematic, and you can drill down and find some topics that might be of enjoyment to you, whether it's flavor development or nut-based cheeses or Ayurveda basics or something else. And I think you might find some of these to be interesting. All right. And let's see, next up. I don't have any restaurant experience, but do have a business background through my current job. Any advice for someone with aspirations to start a vegan restaurant? Yes, my first advice is do so with a heavy dose of caution. Only, and I can talk about this, I think, for hours here, really, but the idea of starting a restaurant of any kind is very risky. Restaurants are they're high expense operations, and profit margins tend to be small, certainly on average, and in most cases. You need to have a very appealing concept in order to be profitable in the restaurant business. And a vegan concept is going to depend upon where you are and how much competition, right, is in that space already. Certainly the plant-based movement, I think, is here to stay. But still, the old meat and potatoes sort of a concept wins out when it comes to appealing to the majority of people in society, at least in the United States. So, you need to approach the restaurant biz with caution. Other aspects of the traditional restaurant model are high labor cost, right? Where you're, again, this will depend on where, let's say, you are in the United States or what region you're in and what the minimum wage is. I'm on the West Coast, and we have the highest minimum wages in the country. Currently, where I am in Oregon, it's 13 and a quarter dollars per hour, due to go up tomorrow on July 1st, and then to ratchet up over the next couple of years until it approaches much closer to $15 an hour. And so that is also a big challenge for restaurant operators. Okay. And then another thing to think about is that in our business, in the restaurant business, or any sort of a food production business, the inventory is perishable. And that is an additional challenge, right? If you're dealing with selling staplers or shoes, that's not a concern, right? You can go on vacation for 10 days. The power can go out for a couple of days. You don't have a concern around the perishability of your inventory, but in this industry you do. And you need to keep an eye on ordering quantities, storage methods, utilization rates, sales forecasts, in order to keep a balance, of your inventory, and to mitigate the loss of product through spoilage. And so, all of these things, add up to challenges. The restaurant industry, the business is very, very challenging, and arguably more challenging than most industries, I will say. And so I would also say that if you're really insistent on opening up a restaurant concept of some sort, that you work for somebody for some period of time to learn all aspects of the business, both the front of the house, which means the customer facing side, and the back of the house, which is the food production side. And all of the idiosyncrasies that go along with that, so that you can foresee what is going on when you venture out on your own. Okay, so that's my overview, okay, of getting into the restaurant business. All right, thank you. Now, just below that, let's see, is another link that Patrick posted, and this particular live event is in our archives, but this particular live event takes a look at recipe ingredient costing. Okay, so this is one aspect of kitchen management that is very important, one that many people getting into the food production business overlook, and one that is just so important as a very basic foundational step. And so you might take a look at this just as a starting point. Thank you. Next up, what do you think about induction cookers? Do you think they can be as good as gas cookers? Do you have a particular brand that you consider good? Yeah, I think induction cookers can function just as well as any other technology, right? Or type of cooking, whether it's gas or electricity, or an open fire, right? Or a charcoal-fired grill, or a stone oven. And I have. I'll first say that it all depends on what you get used to. And I have had wonderful meals cooked in each of those scenarios by people that were, intimately familiar with how to control time and temperature to get the results that they wanted. Okay, so nothing wrong at all with induction cookers. Here at home, I have an induction cooktop that's portable that I use for cooking demonstrations. And it's a Cooktek, Cooktek. It works fine for me. No qualms at all. I don't know of any other brands out there. In other words, I'm not familiar with them, but I know there are brands out there that you might consider. I always recommend looking at customer reviews to help make that choice for you. Okay, thank you. And let's see the next question. Is there an easy way to choose or flag or store our favorite course recipes within the LMS so that we can access them quickly without having to search through all the individual sections to find them later? Okay, so when it comes to recipes, in the recipe gallery, you can bookmark recipes. And then that'll allow you to reference that subset that you selected. And then another approach to this is in your given course, at the bottom of the page is a notes function. And you can click on that. That'll open up a dialog box. You can type in whatever you want, and you can make some comments. In task 23, the tomato sauce recipe is excellent. Use this for parties, right? And then those notes will be accessible to you all together via your dashboard. If you go to your dashboard at the top, you'll see horizontally a number of different functions or tabs to click on. And somewhere in the middle there's one that says notes. And you can click on that note function and see a list of all the notes that you have kept. And then you can then refer to the task where you found that recipe or any other information that's going to be helpful for you. So those are a couple of ways to do that. Do give that a try. If you have further questions on accessing these functions, give us a shout at support@rouxbe.com, and we can walk you through that with some more detail. All right, thank you. And the next question, to me, cooking is still a chore. I'm so stressed out about cooking, so my meals are a hit or miss. I never really know what will happen. I guess I don't have the patience nor the finesse. How did you get to love cooking and to become an actual chef? Okay. So I see two parts to this question here. Let me address part one first. And, that is this idea that cooking is a chore. And, in my experience, things that have been a chore for me have been things that I haven't been that good at. And so they've been cumbersome. They've been difficult. They haven't been enjoyable. But it's been, with the accumulation of experience and therefore the knowledge and the know-how around that activity that has brought more ease and more mental comfort and some fun results, to the process. So I, will often use examples of sports or music. If you're trying to get good at playing the piano, you got to play the piano, right? If you want to get good at playing basketball, you got to play basketball. You got to get out there and dribble with both hands and behind your back and between your legs. You got to shoot. You got to run with the ball. You got to go backwards and sideways. And all those things are very clunky and they're not so fun in the beginning. Same thing with playing music, right? You're squawking and just making all kinds of unpleasant noises, and hand muscles and arm muscles can be sore as you get used to the process. But slowly, right, with knowledge and the control of that activity that comes with the experience, so emerges the joy, right, of that activity. And cooking is the same way. And start out with some narrow repertoire of activities. Now, maybe it's if it's a single activity that you focus on, maybe one cooking method. Maybe it's dry heat. Maybe it's the saute, and then maybe it's just the basics of your knife skill development. And you bring those together to make a saute, right, or a stir fry. And start out with some very basic seasonings and flavor development, and slowly add to that until it becomes a more natural process to you. But certainly there is going to be some hit and miss, especially in the beginning. And I tell you, even down the road, when you continue to encounter some new activities in the kitchen, they're hit and miss. I mean, the idea that I need to test recipes, right, means that I have to get used to that combination of ingredients and cooking methods and knife cuts and as I move toward the desired outcome. And so there's continually going to be some discovery and learning in all these processes, but definitely at that foundational level. Do these different tasks in our courses repetitively, and you will become more and more comfortable with them. And then I think, you'll start to see some joy, right, in that process. Part of it also is to allow yourself to make that mental shift, to find what's fun, in perhaps the end product, right? And I think some of that comes from the successes, right, that inform us and tell us that, yes, I can continue to move down this path and I could have another success. I can experience a good meal again, even though there might be a couple of misses in between. And so do persevere, to that end. Okay. The second part of your question really, is I guess asking a personal story of sorts, right, of my own journey. And, I'll share with you that I grew up in a home that was a food-rich home. my mother was a wonderful cook, and I grew up by her side, doing so many things that she taught me, whether it was crocheting or knitting or cooking. Cooking stuck with me most of all. And I was, intrigued by, what would result from the mise en place. And not that she used that word, but and I also, found full sensory enjoyment of the eating experience. And so that prompted me to learn how to produce these foods that I enjoyed so much. And so it was a slow process, but certainly I had an excellent tutor and a great example in my mother. And, later, as a teenager, took my first cooking classes at the nearby community college, focusing on Italian cooking with a wonderful, Italian home cook, learning some traditional preparations and techniques in the Italian kitchen. Started to accumulate cookware and cutlery, and then, eventually went on my way on a different career path, right? And so getting into food professionally was a switch in my case, which is actually a common story, I think, for a lot of us to get into food professionally. I was a Japanese interpreter and translator for the first decade or so of my life, adult life, but always with food, right? Nipping at my heel. And decided to go to professional culinary school, and I didn't have any intent necessarily to make a career out of this. I just wanted to cook better. But I was just intrigued by all of the interesting relationships with people and food and the intensity of the kitchen experience that I decided to pursue kitchen work, and then eventually made my way up to manage, in particular, catering and banquet operations as a chef, and then made my way into education after that. And so that's just a quick introduction to my own path. But again, it came from a lot of curiosity on my part on how to first of all, satisfy my own palate, but then also recognizing the joy that it brought other people. And I think I'm one of those people that likes to nurture and to give, and food is one of those ways to do that. All right, thank you for asking. All right, next up from Lorena, welcome. So one of the reasons I joined this course is to start a plant-based recipe delivery business. Can you point me to a site or book or something on how to monetize food, how to figure out portion costs adequately, mostly when using top quality ingredients? Okay, excellent, Lorena. Thank you for asking this question. I will first of all direct you to that archived live event that Patrick posted just several minutes ago. And that will provide a great introduction to this idea of recipe ingredient costing, right? That all important step that so many people just don't even know about, and therefore don't do for their small business, and to their detriment. But otherwise, in terms of sources of information, I don't know of a singular book, right, or website, but I am familiar, with some of the vast amount of information on the internet. And if you just do a Google search of how to start a food delivery business, you'll come up with many hits. And take a look at those first 20 or so, and you'll find some pretty solid sources of folks that are willing to share some information on their experience in this field. But at the basis of this is going to be some of those basics that I like to mention, and that is the idea of creating a business plan that will address your potential market, the advertising, the type of product that you will produce, right? Quality ingredients is what you've mentioned, for example. And then, some of the nitty gritty that goes into creating this business concept. The importance of a business plan being that it really directs you to think through the myriad of questions that are part of the startup process. And in order for you to troubleshoot and to identify barriers so that you can back up and then find a barrier-free path to success, okay? And I think certainly, when it comes to a food business, because there are some idiosyncrasies that are associated with the food business, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, it can be a good idea to work either very slowly on your own so that you can work through some of these challenges, discover them, and then solve them on your own, or work with somebody else so that you can work perhaps more quickly through this learning curve in somebody else's business. And certainly, I'm happy to be here as a resource to answer some of these questions for you around kitchen management or recipe costing concerns. There's often more than one answer to some of these food-related questions. And so it's good to have different perspectives and understand why you might choose one path versus the other, okay? Yeah, give that a try in terms of looking at resources on the internet and come up with a business plan and then go from there. All right, thank you. All right, and Wendy asks, can we look forward to a course in sous vide cooking techniques on Rouxbe anytime in the future? Okay, so sous vide cookery, broadly speaking, is this technique where we put food in a vacuum sealed bag, and then we dunk that into a container of water. And the temperature of that water is controlled by a device called an immersion circulator. And that heat circulator can control that temperature of the water to about 1/10 of 1 degree. And so you can do a lot of very interesting things around texture and the degree of doneness of the finished product, because proteins and other components of food will shift and change throughout a temperature range, and so you can pinpoint your desired point of doneness within that range very specifically using this approach. So to answer the question, I will say that we do not have any plans on the books, so to speak, right now at Rouxbe to design a course on sous vide cooking, but I'm certainly happy to introduce this topic to our planning team and see what kind of traction it gets. Right? I appreciate your interest. Thank you. And next up, how are the student pictures for grade cooking tasks sorted? Are all examples included ones that got good marks? So, in the gallery of student photographs that you can click on each of the photo upload assignment task pages, those photographs are there if the student has clicked the box that says to make it public. Okay, and that's really the big variable. So it's not necessarily us that filters that. Okay, and so if you take a look very closely through some of the student examples, you might see some examples that more closely align with the desired outcomes of the assignment, and some that are less aligned with the desired outcomes of that particular assignment. So, as you pick and choose your examples, just look at the details to make sure. Okay, thank you. And see, Kim asks, I'm new to the plant-based whole food cooking. I have no ideas how to buy or prepare tofu. Any starter meal advice? Okay, so let me share a few thoughts on tofu. And the first one is that tofu comes in a number of different densities, from soft, there's medium, there's firm. You can find extra firm as well. There's some other styles of tofu, including some flavored tofus. But I'll right now, for my response to your question, stay with the mainstream varieties that come packed in water or otherwise are very moist, and they come in these different densities that I just mentioned. Generally, I would say just start adding tofu to some of the dishes that you currently make. That's going to be the easiest way to get to know tofu generally, and these different densities or textures more specifically, and also whether you and your dining partners are going to enjoy the tofu. So for example, if you have a stir fry or a saute, that you're making, consider buying some medium or firm tofu and simply cutting that into maybe a dice of a medium size. Medium size is going to be about the size of your thumbnail. Or maybe a bâtonnet, which is about the size of your pinky fingers, kind of long and skinny. And then just add that to the dish. And the tofu will take on any flavors that are around it. So it'll just taste like whatever else you've prepared. But add a different texture and, of course, a different element of nutrition as well. That's going to be the easiest way to do that. Now, if you want to use tofu as a main ingredient, like a tofu steak, then you might want to look at a specific recipe to get that initial inspiration. In at least a couple of our courses, we do have lessons on how to prepare and how to approach baked tofu more generally, in terms of pressing out some of the excess water so that it can take on the added flavors more readily, and then to bake those, in the oven, to further dry them out, to firm up the texture, and to concentrate some of those flavors from the accompanying sauce that you will have produced. Okay, but that's going to be, I think, a nice way to start out in the world of tofu, and then from there, it really goes on. And you can use tofu to make chocolate pudding. You can use tofu to make dressings or other sauces. Tofu can go into many other preparations for texture as well. Okay, thank you. And next up, we've got a question here, I think, says, I'm wondering where you received your training or gleaned your knowledge of Ayurvedic cooking. I'm interested in the intersection of food and wellness. And believe Ayurveda to be a component. I welcome any resources you can provide. Yes, my initial curiosity in Ayurveda started out when I was in high school, hanging out at a New Age bookstore in town, and that was resurrected again later in college when I had a chance to do some writing within the topic of anthropology, medical anthropology, and I did some comparative research between allopathic medicine and Ayurvedic medicine, and then later went on to study Ayurveda in the U.S. Those studies were initially with the Kerala Ayurveda Academy, and then also followed up with that some additional studies at the Chakrapani Clinic in India. And so I focused on digestion and cooking, which is really core to so much of Ayurveda, especially on the daily routine or dinacharya basis. And I also, was lucky enough to, also design an Ayurveda cooking class, which I taught here in Portland, Oregon, for 2 or 3 years at the college level, at the culinary school that I taught at, and also did some speaking on the topic at the Oregon Health Sciences University. I also taught at Portland State University for about a decade and was able to share some Ayurveda insights there, all the while focusing on cooking and sharing that whenever those opportunities came up. So that's an overview, right, of how I got into that aspect of cooking. And I think Ayurveda cooking is very sensible. Once you learn the basic rules around the theoretical framework of Ayurveda, it becomes intuitive. The cooking part of it does. And one of the beauties of Ayurveda cooking is that it's tailored to the individual. So rather than a one-size-fits-nobody approach, it's going to be a customized approach to each diner. And it's something that we incorporate here at home on a daily basis in some way or another, and have been doing so for the last decade or so. And I hope that you'll pursue that as well, Noreen. I think it could be a great way to approach cooking. Thank you. Next up, I live in a small mountain community with 2 small grocery stores with limited spice and herb sections. Are there online suppliers you might recommend? There are a number of different herb and spice suppliers online. And, I will first say that, most of my experience ordering online was with a wholesale account. Okay. As, I did buying and also placed orders for our culinary school and or assisted with that process. And but for the home cook, I don't know. You might just take a look at some reviews online. There are always popular companies like Penzies that have online access for ordering, but there are also many other possibilities. Okay. Let's see. We'll move on to the next one. How do you cook more than one thing at the same time in the same oven on different racks, and what that does to the cooking time, etc. Okay. So this is a bit of a challenge, and I think the first thing you want to do is to keep track of the different times, right, of these different dishes or different preparations. They're all going to have a different start time and a different cooking duration and a different end time. Now, the challenge comes in when things have different cooking times, right? It might be required for you to find some middle ground in the temperature setting of the oven that can accommodate all the items that you're preparing, okay? But otherwise, you just, you get your items in there, write down on a notepad which items went in at what time, maybe using an actual timer, and what the cooking duration is, so you can check for doneness at the appropriate times, and then pull out those items when they're ready, while leaving in the other items that require more time to finish. Okay, and what you can part of this overall strategy that we employ here at home, and I certainly have in restaurant settings, is that once an item is pulled out, you can always finish the remaining item with the broiler, or by turning on the convection fan to really crank up the heat circulation and to speed up the browning to finish. And so there are these other aspects of this logistical puzzle here that we're talking about that can be very interesting. Okay. And, I will also add that, there are newer ovens. They've been around for a number of years now, but they're really used at the commercial level. But you can certainly buy them for home. These are these electronic ovens and that are really computer controlled, and they are even connected wirelessly to the manufacturer, so that if you have questions that come up, you can just push a pad on the control panel and interface with somebody to help you troubleshoot. And these things, walk you through this process as well, with multiple timers that are built in. They will prompt you to pull items and to check items and to switch items and to add items. One of these companies that I'm familiar with is Rational or Rational. And this is a German company that markets these, high-tech ovens. They're more expensive than our run-of-the-mill home oven, but some of the smaller units might be within the budget of your home if you want to do some of this stuff. So give that a try. Thank you. Next up, do you need special equipment to dehydrate food, or can you do it in the oven? You don't need special equipment. It's not necessary. You can certainly do it in the oven on the lowest temperature setting. And that's at about 170 or so degrees Fahrenheit, which is still pretty warm, in which case I recommend propping the door open. I use a wooden spoon, or sometimes just a kitchen towel that's rolled up. And so it's propped open a little bit to let that heat escape. And you can certainly do dehydrating in that setting. Or if you have a nice, hot, sunny day, with some, hopefully some air circulation, you can set food out to dehydrate, in that natural sort of way. If you're setting it outside, you might want to cover it with some sort of a net to keep birds or, other critters out of your food. Otherwise, that is a very nice way to dehydrate food. And next up, what about Roundup? I've heard it's in all of our food from the roots up. Oh, okay. So the Roundup chemical, yes. Okay, I'll address that. So, generally speaking, or maybe I should say more specifically speaking, Roundup as a chemical input is associated with specific seeds. Okay, it's been engineered to be grown with specific seeds, and the way this works is, so Roundup is an herbicide. So the way this works is these seeds have been genetically modified to be resistant to the Roundup herbicide. Okay, so that you can spray. When I say you, I mean it's really larger scale farmers, okay, on the agribusiness scale that use this product. And they would buy this from the former Monsanto, and it would because pulling weeds has been historically such a labor intensive and expensive aspect of farming, that these seeds were designed so that you can just spray your farm with Roundup. These are called Roundup Ready seeds. Once they sprout and grow, you can spray them with Roundup. You can fly your airplane over your field and spray it with Roundup and kill all the weeds, but not kill your crop. Okay, so if you're buying these GM foods, these genetically modified foods, then you're going to get the chances that you might have some of these Roundup sprayed crops is going to be relatively high. Okay, now if you're focusing on non-GMO foods, then technically the farm operation should be falling outside of this sort of Roundup ready world of farming. Okay, and you should be able to steer clear of these herbicides. Now, if someone is still using Roundup, then that's another question, right? We really don't have a way to trace that necessarily. So it could be a bit of a risk, but certainly much, much, much lower than if you're buying the genetically modified foods that have a much higher chance of being associated with Roundup ready seeds and the application of a Roundup, the herbicide, during its growth life. Okay, thank you. What's the difference between flavor and taste? In my last assessment, I was asked to be more detailed in describing those two in my tastes. Can you explain? Also, I use a wok in my cooking. Does the oil I use in seasoning it matter? So first of all, what is flavor and taste? So, we grew up oftentimes using these words interchangeably, and even really to some extent among all of us, including food pros, it is sometimes used. They are used interchangeably. But more strictly speaking, if we talk about taste, we're going to be referring to those sensations in the mouth that are picking up the aspects of saltiness and sour and sweetness. There's bitterness and astringency. There's pungency. These aspects of the food are typically referred to as taste, whereas flavor then encompasses, to a large extent, the sense of smell. All right. So it's going to be a combination of our taste receptors in our mouth and in our throat, combined with the smells that we get from these foods that equal flavor. So flavor is much, much more nuanced than taste. So there might be 5 or 6 tastes, depending on the way you approach food. I think of it as 6 tastes. And there are thousands of flavors based upon the aromas of the food. Okay, so that's going to be the difference there. So in our assignments, right, we ask, and this is particularly true of our pro courses, pro plant and pro cook, where we ask students to go much deeper in their written description than in the Forks Over Knives course, for example. And so here we're going to ask you to really stop and think and really start to get to know your food, all through the process as well as in the finished preparation. And so this is where we ask you to write details around the taste and the flavor and the aroma and the texture of these dishes. Okay. And as far as seasoning a wok is concerned, some people have some specific, very specific requirements for this sort of thing. I generally recommend to people to use an oil with a relatively high smoke point. You're going to enter that smoking range anyway, but just use some inexpensive oil that you can just cook onto that surface. You can bake on either in the oven or it could be done on the stovetop. Either way, and you're going to be fine. Okay, I think that answers the components here. Thank you. Next up from Aruna. I'm new to deep frying and I'm intimidated by the vat of hot oil, particularly the temperature getting too high. Any tips on getting this right? Excellent question. And I think a very meaningful one, right? Working with oil has its inherent risks and dangers associated with it. So I think there's always, it's always good to approach with some caution. And so some things that come to mind for me include, use a pan that is deep enough that you can safely add your required oil and not risk, spilling the oil over the top. And so, you might want to, avoid filling the pot too high. too full with oil to begin with. And also consider using a thermometer, at least in the beginning, and take a look at the smoke point of the oil that you're using so that you can stay below that point. We don't want to reach the smoke point because the oil itself starts to burn and it starts to become damaged, and the taste also shifts in a negative way. And it's probably not good for us health-wise also to eat or to consume the oil that has been damaged in this way. So at least initially, it's good to use a thermometer. And then as you're doing the cooking, right, whether you're batter frying or something else, maybe crumb frying, breading and frying your food, pay attention to the sound of the food, the look of the food, how large or small the bubbles are, how intense the bubbling oil is, to gauge the heat of the oil. And start to learn visually so that eventually you don't have to use a thermometer. Okay. And then use utensils. I like to use chopsticks, but you might very carefully use tongs. I don't often recommend tongs because they can damage food, or use. I would say preferably use a small strainer. Maybe a kind of a flat strainer that you can flip the food item with and also pull it out of the oil. Also when it comes to the cooking method of frying, you want to pull that item out of the oil onto a cutting board and cut through it with a knife, right through the thickest portion, and then look for doneness, test for doneness to make sure that it's cooked all the way through, or that it's not overcooked. And then you can make adjustments from there. Of course, if it's undercooked, then the fix is very easy. But if it's overcooked, then next time, right, through your timer, right, through your thermometer and through the experience that you're gaining, you're going to cook that food just a little bit less in time, or maybe in heat intensity by lowering the heat. Okay. And then you can, eventually build up that experience base to get that perfectly cooked, deep fried food item. But all the while, again, using the thermometer and visually looking at the way that the food acts and reacts in that oil, okay, to do your best job. But practice is going to be a big part of that, okay? So give that a try, Aruna. Thank you. Next up, hello. How can I keep the coriander and parsley fresh? Also, green vegetables. This question was answered earlier in our program today, but I'll touch upon it just very briefly. That is, you want to protect these items in the refrigerator from the circulating air, especially the fresh coriander, right, or the cilantro, so that it doesn't dry out too quickly and get too wilted. And then also, wrap these things in a very lightly damp towel, cloth or paper is fine, in order to balance some of the dehydration that takes place in the refrigerator. Okay, and then green vegetables. It depends on what it is. So something like a bell pepper doesn't like really cold environments. And so the best thing to do is to try to protect that from some of the circulating cold air. Maybe try to put it in the warmest part of the refrigerator, which generally is going to be closest to the door or on the door itself. Because, each time we open the refrigerator, we're introducing it to some warm air from the kitchen environment. So that's going to help with some of these more delicate and finicky vegetables. Otherwise, more generally with vegetables, the same sort of principles apply as to the herbs. That is, you want to protect them from the dehydrating environment of the refrigerator. So covering them with a towel to protect them from the circulating air is very helpful, as well as covering them with a very lightly damp towel to reintroduce some moisture to the product, or otherwise mitigate the dehydration that will occur in the refrigerator. Okay, so give that a try. Thanks. Nutritional yeast, what would substitute it well? Okay, Sylvia. So nutritional yeast is used as I guess a taste additive, right? To add some umami to a food, or flavor-wise, that cheesy sort of an element. It's a deeper, fuller, rounder sort of a flavor to the preparation. And so in place of nutritional yeast, I mean, I think about onion and garlic, if those are things that you can eat. In place of onion and garlic, you might consider asafoetida. Asafoetida is sold in the spice section of an Indian or South Asian grocery store, and it's a plant resin that is used as a spice in Indian or South Asian cooking. And it's not exactly the same as nutritional yeast, but it does offer some of the fuller flavors that come along with onion and garlic. And other things that we might reach for that might provide some of these deeper, fuller flavors, while not specifically tasting like nutritional yeast, will be oftentimes satisfying to the palate, might include miso paste, or a mole paste from a Mexican grocery store, or a product like Vegemite that adds, again, this richer, fuller umami sort of a flavor. So you might consider any of these different products or ingredients in place of nutritional yeast for, more generally speaking, that fuller, satisfying experience on the palate. Okay, and next up. Is the garlic that is served with sushi the same as the? Oh, I'm sorry. Is the garlic that's served with sushi the same as the ginger root found in grocery stores? Okay, so I think the question here is the ginger served with sushi, which is that oftentimes pink tinted, oftentimes or sometimes just natural tan colored product called gari. And is it the same as the ginger root found in grocery stores? So the quick answer is yes. However, the product used as a pickle at the sushi restaurant is made from young ginger. And what we find in grocery stores usually is the more mature and more fibrous ginger. And the young ginger is much more tender and has a more mild flavor. And then once you pickle that with a little bit of vinegar and a little bit of sugar, you got to slice it very, very thinly on the mandolin. Then you can very, very easily replicate what you find at the sushi restaurant. All right. Next up, we have 2 questions from Karen. How to estimate how much vegetable to buy when recipes call for cups, etc., and how to chop an onion without crying. Aha. So, the first one is the answers are variable here. Okay, not what you wanted to hear, I'm sure, but so much of what we do in the kitchen is variable. So when it comes to a volume measure of something, it's going to depend upon the size of the cut. So, for example, if you cut something in a small dice, you'll require more of that to fill up 1 cup in volume than you would a large dice of the same item, right? Filling up 1 cup. And so this is where I think some experience comes into play. And maybe the willingness to have a little bit of leftover on hand and then to improvise, right, with some of those leftover pieces of vegetables or fruits that we might have. There are guides that you can use, and these are, volume to weight guides for the kitchen. And these guides will often have the whole, unprocessed version of that food as well listed. And that gives you an idea of how to do this. And one of my favorite guides to use is called the Book of Yields. And it's really a fantastic book, filled with all kinds of information around food prepping. And so for any of you getting into a food preparation business, like Lorena earlier asked about, how to start a food delivery business, I would say that somebody in that position would want a reference like this. The Book of Yields is the one that I like to use. And it has information that will help you bridge this gap, right, between the whole food in its unprocessed form and a cup measure, or something that's diced, large dice versus small dice, and the cup measure. Okay, so there's not an easy single answer to give you, Karen. The second part of this is how to chop an onion without crying. I don't know. I used to get kind of silly in my culinary classes, and when I do demos for my students, I'd wrap my head in plastic wrap, poke a hole in my mouth, and breathe through my mouth as I was doing a cutting demo. That worked, actually, but it looked kind of frightening. But otherwise, I still cry. I don't know what the answer is. All right. Next up, when it comes to baking in large amounts, which is the best for you flour to use? Okay. So baking in flours, the best for you, I read that as sort of the most nutritious or most nutrient dense flour. Generally speaking, it's going to be a whole grain flour. And, all the grains that are out there that are used in baking, and there are so many of them, right? Quinoa and certainly wheat, oats, barley, triticale, and the list goes on and on. But all of these in their whole form offer wonderful nutrients, just a wonderful nutrient profile. They're all a little bit different. But the beauty is that their flavors and their textures and their colors are also different, so that your end product also has this beautiful presentation to it. And so in that sort of manner, I hesitate to identify a single item that's best for you. Instead, I say enjoy any of these items in their whole grain context, and then there's really nothing to be concerned about. Okay. And next up, thank you, Patrick, for listing up the Book of Yields, okay, as a reference here. And next up from Donna, when making nut or seed-based raw dehydrated crackers and cutting the crackers into circular shapes, for instance, what are some good uses for the leftover misshapen dehydrated material? Okay. Wow, that's interesting. I am apt to just dry them and to use that just as a little snack item on the side. If I'm going to be using, excuse me, if I'm going to be using the nice circular cutouts for tacos or to build canapes or something else like that, I'll have these odds and ends left over. I want a snack at some point, or maybe I want to just put out a little snack plate for our kiddo here at home. So that's what I'm apt to do. First of all, is just to go ahead and dehydrate those and use them as little dippers for hummus or something else. Otherwise, I'm probably apt to try frying them and making a nice chip out of them, and then pair them with the same hummus as well. But we're big on dipping things here at home into bean dips, for example, and so that's where I would guide you. All right, thank you. Let's see. Lauren asked, you mentioned tahini. Yes. Do you have a recommended brand? No, I don't. I was just down at the halal store a few days ago and picked up a big jar of tahini. There were, I don't know, 5 or 6 different brands. I didn't read all the labels. I picked up the biggest jar, and turns out it was, made in the USA. And it tastes good. It's fantastic. But I don't have a recommended brand. I would say give a few a try, of course, and you can probably pick something that suits your palate the best. But I've tried. There's one that comes in a tin, which is nice. I've tried at least half a dozen different brands, I'd say, and they're all fine with me. I guess I'm not that picky with tahini. They all taste good and they do the job for me. Thank you. Let's see. Next up, what type of foods would you recommend to prepare in advance that are easy to take on the go as a nutritional snack and or meal? Okay. Well, I guess a couple of ideas that come to mind, would be a plant-based patty. We talked a little bit about plant-based sausages earlier in today's show, and I think that same sort of a product can travel very well, in a hard container. And if you can bring some sort of a sauce in a different container, that works out very nicely. You can even bring some bread with you and build your own sandwich on the road, and something we've done many times. Another similar approach to sandwiches is to just slice up a bunch of different vegetables, tomatoes and cucumbers, some lettuce, maybe some onion if you like, and bring a chutney or two and some nice bread, sliced bread or a roll or whatever form is going to be, fun for you to eat. And then you can build your own sandwich. And that provides a nice light salad-like sandwich, which also feels very substantial from the bread and has a satisfying feel on the palate from the intense flavor of the chutneys. So those are, a couple of things that come to mind. In terms of snacks, it seems like we've always got some quick bread, on the counter here in the kitchen. And, just yesterday, we ran down to the Rail Heritage Museum here in Portland and took some banana bread with us. And I'm always playing with those sort of formulas. So I'm used whole leaf stevia as a sweetener in one loaf, and mix and match in nuts and other flours. I had some chestnut flour that I used, and so all that stuff I think is a pretty decent source of food. I'm always either omitting added sugars, right, or using whole food sources of sweeteners. And so, trying to make them as clean as I can. And I consider them to be a pretty decent snack. Certainly there's a lot of flour, but I try to use the whole grain flours. But those are some ideas for you. All right, thank you. What's the best piece of pork meat to buy for pulled pork burgers? Yes, pork. Okay, pork butt. Pork butt comes from right here. It's the shoulder, code name butt. And that is what's used for your pulled pork. It's heavily marbled. It's naturally about 25% fat. Once you slow cook that, it could be in the oven, it could be in a pressure cooker. It's going to be very, very tender and succulent. And, you can season it and flavor it in any direction that you want. Okay. Next up, cooking for 20 peeps. How do you go calculating ingredient amounts? Okay. Great question. Let me first of all say that, there are guides on the market that you can look at And I think one title is called Cooking for 50, which has been an old book out there for food service. There is another book out there that I have on my bookshelf upstairs, and I can't remember the author's name. Doesn't do you any good, does it? You can always send me a message through support@rouxbe.com, and I'd be happy to share that title and author with you. This particular book I'm thinking about has a bunch of party recipes, and it's formatted for something like 12 and 25 and 50 and 75 people. So you can just kind of go down the columns and get a good idea of the quantities of the recipes that you need. Otherwise, I'll explain to you the basic approach, and that is you want to look at your starting recipe and you want to determine how many portions it makes. And let's say that it makes 5 entree-sized portions. Okay, in that case, you want to get that, and let's say those entree-sized portions are 6 ounces each. Okay, so 5 times 6 gives you 30 ounces of food products, and you would then multiply that by 4 to bring it up to the original 5 portions up to your desired 20 portions. Okay, and so long as you're maintaining the same portion size of 6 ounces each. When I say 6 ounces, I mean 6 ounces on a scale. Okay, now if you wanted to change that to 20 appetizer portions of 3 ounces, all right, then you can take that. There's some additional math involved there, but what you want to do is calculate the total quantity of the recipe. The original recipe was 5 portions at 6 ounces, 30 ounces of total food, and then let's see here. There's an additional division of math involved, a couple more steps to figure out what you need for the revised target of 20 portions at 3 ounces each. So 20 times 3 is going to be 60 ounces of desired product total. So I guess you would multiply by 2 to get you there. So there's a what's called a conversion factor that you would calculate and then use to move to your desired production volume. Okay, but this is all spelled out, I think, in these books that I've mentioned, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you have further questions. All right, thank you. All right, next up. Okay, yes, from Lorena. I was wondering if the wok can be deglazed with lemon or another liquid while it's still hot for those sticky remainders, or will the patina be damaged? Okay, so all of that that seasoning, that patina, that non-stick sort of a surface that develops on an iron pan or a wok over time, consists of fats and proteins and other parts of the food that kind of bond together at that microscopic level. And because some of it is fat, some of it of that will loosen up if you use acidic ingredients like lemon juice. So if you use something that's non-acidic like stock, or even a little bit of water, you won't lift off so much of that. Okay. But the reality is that over time, there's a removal process and an addition process of this patina right on your wok. And with each cooking cycle, you're cooking, so you're laying down more of that surface. When you clean, you might be lifting off a little bit of that surface. So be as gentle as you can in terms of using a neutral liquid, not rubbing and scrubbing so hard as you are lifting off those sticky remainders, and then also not scrubbing so hard and not using soap for the most part when you clean. the wok as well. But also keep in mind that, over time, it might be necessary to re-season the wok. And so that's a natural step in the life cycle of your cookware. All right, thank you. And next up from Sandra, my husband doesn't like tomato-based recipes. He says it tastes sweet to him. So any recommendations on what I can do to make the sauces less sweet? Okay, so excellent. So your husband is picking up one of these basic tastes that we commonly associate with tomatoes, especially ripe tomatoes. It's going to be that natural sweetness that emerges. So in order to, really to balance and to mask some of that, we need to create a more complex flavor in that dish. So to begin with, you might start with adding a sour ingredient. So it could be vinegar, it could be a squeeze of lime juice or lemon juice, for example, and that'll help to start balancing the sweetness in the tomato products. And then start adding other flavorful ingredients in the mix, whether it's, sauteed onions and garlic. It could be a foundation of spices, or an addition of spices in some fashion, or finishing it with some fresh herbs, freshly chopped herbs, which we talked about earlier in today's program. And all of these additional ingredients serve to add layers of flavor and complexity to a dish so that the once unidimensional sweetness of the tomatoes is now made more subtle. Okay, and so that's my recommendation to controlling the sweetness of the tomatoes. All right, thank you. So let's see, I'm looking for onion seeds. This is the same as Nigella. So these are often labeled as the same thing. Now, botanically, I'm not certain just off the top of my head without making a quick reference. But certainly if, you're making a dal recipe, then Nigella is probably going to be what you want for that particular preparation. Okay. I do not like the bitter taste of Swiss chard, so I avoid making it, but I know it is a great leafy green and should be a part of my whole food, plant-based lifestyle. What can I do to enjoy this gem of a plant besides smothering it in lemon juice? Okay. So my favorite thing to do with any sort of things that may otherwise stand out in an imbalanced sort of way is just to incorporate it in smaller doses, cutting it smaller and then just incorporating it in some way. So, with Swiss chard, cut it small or cut it, into a chiffonade, add that to a stir fry, add that to a saute, and you're going to get the goodness of that food product. But the other items in that saute are going to stand out, and characterize that dish. Now, also at the same time, think about how you'll be using the bitterness of the chard in a balanced sort of way in that preparation. Okay, so maybe there's some sweetness from tomatoes or zucchini. Maybe some sweetness from onions that have been gently sauteed, and you got a little bit of salt that's added, and then you can bring up a little bit of bitterness from a little bit of chard to make an overall balanced dish. So think of it from that perspective as well. Okay. And next question from Brian. When I make salsa using canned tomatoes, the salsa turns out very sweet. Any suggestions to improve the taste using canned tomatoes or ditch canned tomatoes for salsa? Let's see. So a couple of things come to mind. First of all, take a look at the ingredient list on the can, just to ensure, just to see if any sweetener has been added. And if that's the case, then you might select a canned product that has no sugar or no sweetener added. The other thing to keep in mind, as we just talked about moments ago, is that tomatoes naturally develop sweetness from all the beautiful sugars. So it's common that canned product will be sweet anyway. So here, when I make salsa, for example, I'm adding a fair amount of onions, which adds some pungency, some earthiness to it. I'm adding a generous amount of cilantro, which adds a little bit of grassiness and sometimes even just a little edge of bitterness, kind of depending on how green it is. I putting in the whole thing, stems and leaves and everything. I'll bring in some chilies. I tend to use the Thai sort of bird's beak type chilies with some nice heat, and so that taste, right, the pungency from the chilies also acts to balance the overall sensation on the palate. So the sweetness is just one component of several now. And then I'm adding a little bit of salt to bring up that corner or that area of the palate, the flavor palette here. So in this way, sweetness is no longer dominant. It's one of 5 or 6 different tastes and other subtle flavors that are part of the salsa. And so that's going to be a more typical salsa fresca. Now you can always go down a different path and add other ingredients, whether they're sauteed mushrooms or something else that really change the profile and can add some heavier earthy notes that compete with the sweetness of the tomatoes. So you might want to think out of the can, so to speak, and to do some creative salsa production as well and see what you come up with. All right, thank you. Next up for tasks, can we use different ingredients, i.e. substituting, especially during this time when certain products are not readily available? For instance, using AP flour when gluten-free flour mix is the requirement. So I'll answer this question in 2 ways, and I thank you for asking this because it's so important for everyone to hear. And number one, feel free to on any of the practice recipes, make any substitutions that you want. Absolutely any that you want that makes sense to you. For recipes that are part of an assignment, my general response is yes, you can make substitutions. However, the substitution should not then stray away from the desired outcome, the learning outcome of the assignment. Okay, I'll give you an example that I see every once in a while. In our clear soup assignment, it's based upon stock, right? You can make a vegetable stock, kind of in that North American sort of a sense. There's also a pho, more spicy stock that's offered to you as well. On occasion, a student will say in the assignment that they submitted, gosh, I don't like vegetable stock. In fact, I don't like a clear stock-based soup at all. Instead, I'm going to submit a cream of mushroom soup, and they submit this substitution. Now, I don't, mind cream of mushroom soup on a personal level, but as far as the learning outcome goes, you have now created an example of a different category of soup, and so that assignment is going to receive 0 points. If you can change ingredients in this case while still making a clear stock-based soup. Okay, I hope that makes sense. There are certainly other examples. And if you have a specific example for an assignment and you have a question about that, question as to whether your substitution will be okay or not, please send us a line, question at support@rouxbe.com. Or you can ask in the Q&A function, in that task, and we'll answer that question for you. Okay. I think the support@rouxbe.com is probably most appropriate for substitution questions. Okay, thank you. And let's see, from Laura, we have a link. Let's see. Kale avocado salad. Massaging with avocado is a great thing for those I cook for who didn't, but now do like. Okay, great. Yeah, thanks very much for sharing this idea on how to handle kale. Yeah, you bet. And so this kale avocado salad, is also aligned with one of our assignments in a couple of our courses that walks you through, how to alter the flavor and texture of these, I'll say harsh greens, like bitter sort of greens, whether it's kale or something else. And so, yeah, this is a great example of how fats and acids and salt can be used to create something much more enjoyable out of something that was bitter. Thank you, Laura. Can I use oyster mushrooms in a stew? What are other ways I can prepare these mushrooms? Yes, you bet. Oyster mushrooms go very nicely in a stew. They go nicely in pilaf, in risotto, in a mushroom saute, or they can play a secondary role in a different type of saute. They can go into a tomato sauce with a pasta. Most any sort of preparation can, where you might think of a mushroom more generally, right? Can handle an oyster mushroom. Okay. And next up, from Robin, for plant-based eating, any suggestion to replace the bean and legume proteins that are easier to digest? Well, let's see. So if you're right in front of me, I would ask you more specifically what your concern is about the digestibility of the beans and legumes. If it's a specific concern to yourself, then I understand without understanding. But if it's a general concern, like for example lectins in beans, then to that my response would be that concern can be mitigated by cooking beans fully, and which is the way we should handle beans anyway, right? To fully cook them so they're nice and soft and enjoyable on the palate. And then that concern of lectins pretty much goes away, according to my understanding. So I focus on beans here because beans and legumes broadly are really such a wonderful food to have in the diet, and to omit them entirely, unless there's a specific health reason to do so, is not generally recommended. But anyway, as far as a replacement from a protein standpoint, I would say that you don't have to worry about the protein in your food, because all plant-based foods have the amino acid building blocks for protein. Okay. Now, the amino acids all come in different quantities in these different foods, plant foods, but they're present. And the body knows how to put those together in a way to build the protein that we need. So it's important that we eat a variety of plant-based foods in order to get this spectrum of amino acids for our body. Okay. And as you probably know, right? The concern is that most plants provide an array of amino acids that are not in its quote unquote complete form, like you commonly would find in meat or animal-based foods. But again, if we're eating a variety of plant-based foods, then there is no concern for getting adequate protein. Okay, it's really a rare example of a person that needs a more concentrated dosage of protein. All right, in which case, things like seeds and nuts, right, could be a good source of that. But on an ongoing basis, seeds and nuts probably aren't recommended to eat, in large doses because of the high fat content. So keep that in mind. All right. Let's see. Cindy asks, where can one purchase asafoetida? I look for an Indian grocer, right, or more generally a South Asian grocer. So it might, depend on your neighborhood. It could be a Sri Lankan grocer or a Pakistani grocer, but most commonly it's an Indian grocery store. And then you can ask for asafoetida, sometimes called hing, Hing, and the folks at the store will point you to that product. And next up, what are all the elements that make a 3 Michelin star dish? Well, Michelin stars are doled out to restaurants as a whole, right, rather than a dish, if you want to be literal about this title here. In which case we're talking about ambiance and service in addition to consistency and quality of the food. I think uniqueness and personality are part of that as well. And I mentioned consistency, which is very important. There's just some of the general things that go into that. You might take a look online. There's some more information on what Michelin critiques look for. I certainly understand there are some more humble restaurants or food purveyors like food stalls that have received Michelin stars. But again, exquisite quality and palate experience and consistency are definitely part of that. And okay, great. So name of the cookbook, that I mentioned earlier regarding parties and preparing food for 20 or 75, for example, is Do It for Less, Parties by Denise Vivaldo. So there's your answer. What are your favorite things to ferment? Let's see. Some things that I would purposely ferment. There's occasionally things in the fridge that are not intended to be fermented. But as we talked about earlier today, the occasional cheese with the addition of probiotics can be kind of fun for something different. On occasion here at home, we'll do a kimchi. Something kind of mainstream in that sense. Okay. And that brings us to the end of the questions today and the close of my office hours. Thank you very much for those of you that stuck it out from the beginning and for those of you that joined midstream. I hope I was able to answer your questions. And as always, if you have additional questions, please email us at support@rouxbe.com, and we'd be happy to answer your questions. Until next time, happy cooking. Thank you very much.